Hello, everybody, and welcome to the October 11th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting with Steven Becker. We've been having a lot of very interesting conversations leading up to this meeting. Recommend that if you haven't already and you have the time to spare, check out the YouTube channel for MakerDAO and have a look at the Scientific Governance playlist and get caught up. It's worth it. We were just discussing courses that people can take in financial risk management, and pointed out that this is actually a kind of an introduction to that very course. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, check out the YouTube videos, and then maybe hit up David Utro bin for options for real world educational opportunities. Stephen, I'm going to let you just jump right in and maybe give us a recap of what happened 2 weeks ago and what we're going to do today.
So 2 weeks ago, we mostly spent our time talking about Andreessen and the partnership that we had with Andreessen, we had a look at the form and content and function of that partnership, and obviously what we wish to achieve and of that partnership and all the objectives that we would like to see come from it. We didn't really touch on anything risk-based. It was mostly a case of saying, why are we doing this? How are we going forward? And I articulated mostly where this partnership helps us in terms of the network effects on the business development side, on the marketing side. The partnership extends to looking at, the depth of talent that is available in the industry. And if we want to tap on that, we can. And then obviously the interesting part is formalizing the regulatory plan and figuring out how to become not only partners with the regulators, but ongoing partners with all of the regulatory bodies that we need to around the world. Big ask, big task, but the point being is we have to start somewhere. So today we can go back to very basic risk management again. We can start talking about all those sort of wonderful things that we've spoken about before. We've covered everything from the underlying risks in the system through to calculating the liquidation ratio and to the debt ceiling. We started touching on correlation risk, which I think everyone is probably more familiar with. And we still have to maybe have a look at stability fee, how that's calculated specifically. I know we did touch on that. And bring in the concept of economic capital. And then after that, we can start talking about governance, actual governance. What does it mean? How does it work? And what are the responsibilities? So any questions before I start? Any questions from folks online or folks that we've had on the social media side? Rich?
No, things have been, I think that we sort of bombarded people with mass quantities of really big news, and I think that there's been a lot of the risk things floating around, but hopefully we'll be able to stir things up again.
Yeah, I get the feeling that I need to sort of dial it back a bit so everybody can sort of put their, relax their brain a bit. So
yeah, actually, do you know what I would love to see? And I guess we probably shouldn't be planning these meetings while we're having these meetings, but what I would love to see towards the end of this track is maybe a summary call where we just like recap exactly like every one of the major points, and then
what I'm hoping to do on the back of that is the third paper that is going to come out soon, I promise, is going to come out with a technical addendum as well. And that technical addendum, you're probably going to have to download from the website because it's got LaTeX in it, which is obviously just a mathematical typeset that Medium, the blog, doesn't really like at all. In fact, if you have a look at my the second article, I used some very basic math, and the formula was either this big or like that small. It just didn't really work well in Medium. So I'm going to have an addendum that we can use. But in that, I'm going to give a sort of a full example of what does governance mean all the way through to how do you actually see voting work, how and what would you vote on. And I'll give an example of voting on a collateral type and voting in risk parameters. And then once we've got that out, then the sort of future meetings we can that we have, we can actually start talking about the different aspects of it. What are we thinking? So not to glaze everyone's eyes over, but I just want to then just emphasize two things. So correlation risk, as everyone has recalled, is about finding that diversification buffer in the collateral portfolio. What I mean by that is, in the normal investment space, if you've got a diversification benefit, you use it. What that means is that you increase your exposure to obviously up your returns. So therefore, your return to risk ratio will be improved. But in the space that we're operating, we're looking for risk mitigation intersecting with business development. We don't have the choice of saying, well, we're only going to have certain levels of collateral types and then go out there and purchase those collateral types up to that level. We have to put those levels in place, and then we have to wait for the business to come to us. So that is why it's very important to keep those diversification benefits in your back pocket as a capital buffer against any sort of extraneous sort of risk movement that you might see in the market. Now, that then also leads on to how you book build the collateral portfolio. It's all very well to 10 collateral types and give them debt ceilings and declare them all good and well. But the way that you actually increase that portfolio size is then dependent on how those individual collateral types are used. You might find that of the 10, only 2 are used, or of the 10, you max out on 1 and you're kind of stuck there. You need to make a business decision on the back of it. This is not purely a risk function. There's a business function in here as well. Okay, so that's correlation. We all know that.
Sorry, can I jump in? Maybe I even asked this question 2 weeks ago, but I'm going to ask it again. So is it the responsibility of the risk management team to attempt to incentivize some of these lesser used collateral types, or do we assume that there's just no interest there and we try and rebalance the portfolio in other ways?
Well, there are 2 policy tools that we can use. The one is, and this is the stability fee. This is where I was going to head to next. So with the stability fee, you've got the ability to look after the demand and supply of DAI overall, by obviously attracting the requisite amount of CDP users. But you can use a very specific policy tool for each of the collateral types. It is not terribly easy to do. If you find that certain collateral types are not used, it generally isn't because of the level of the stability fee. It really is more because of the liquidity of that collateral. So that's why it behooves the risk team to ensure that the collateral types that we use have a very clearly defined path to a secondary market, so that price discovery is clear, so that liquidation is clear, so that you know that if you do purchase collateral in a liquidation, you know where to go. So that is really where I think the business risk would be, is to ensure that we do have that liquidity basis. If you find that, relatively speaking, one collateral type is moving faster than the other, then yes, you can do policy planning on a per collateral type basis. But that is a very sort of relativistic play. It's not absolute. But the stability fee, as we mentioned before, we looked at that and we saw how it's actually made up of the sort of inflationary part, the credit risk / policy part, and then the credit premium part. And what we do is we ensure that there's enough stability fee in there to compensate the risk that MKR token holders are taking with respect to those particular loans based on that collateral type, failing, where they have to dilute and obviously pick up the tab. But the most important part, I suppose, is what the policy instruments component is and how we use it. As you saw previously, the stability fee on ETH was picked up from 50 basis points to 2.5%. That was more getting the stability fee in line with the short-term risk-free rates on US interest rates. It just gave a more comparable feel, where 50 basis points was No, it's good, but it's a nice lead for everyone to get used to the get used to the product, get used to the idea. But when you have a look at something like 2.5%, it's still very competitive, but it is at least in the region of what is realistic and realistic to maintain. Okay, so that's stability fee. Now, one has to look back at something called expected shortfall and economic capital, because that's where we get the sense of the credit component of the stability fee, which means how much of that stability fee must go to pay for the so-called insurance, or the ability for MKR to pony up when needed, the certain amount that has to be put in place. Now, that is done using, as I mentioned before, the expected shortfall, which is you just take your I'm trying to figure out how to not say this in technical jargon, but I'm going to do it, and then I'll try and explain it. You take your 99% valued risk as your conditional level, and you have a look at what happens over it. In other words, you look at the extent of the tail risk. You really go far to the right of the tail risk, or rather, if you look at it far to the left of the tail risk, and you aggregate what that exposure is going to look like past a certain level. So you may have
a really stupid question. So every once in a while we come up or use you mentioned industry term that I'm not entirely familiar with. So can you define tail risk for me really quickly?
Okay, so tail risk is very much the same as your black swan event. It's something that is highly unlikely to happen, and in the event that it happens, generally you would have no idea how much you could possibly lose. Mm-hmm. So a whole bunch of very smart people used very specific statistical distributions to figure out what tail risk looks like given a certain event occurs. Now, when I say a certain event, it's almost like saying, if a black swan is going to happen, that is your condition, how much should we expect to lose? Now, it seems deeply ironic because the answer is actually, I don't know. But there have been sufficient amounts of tail events, 5, 6 sigma events that really have happened far out in the tail. There have been enough of those events to be able to actually start formulating, structural distributions and understanding around it. A good example of this is, I think it was a hydrologist. His name's Hurst, and he came up with an analysis that showed how to not only predict when flooding is going to happen, but to what extent flooding was going to happen. But once again, flooding is a very improbable tail event, and it was very important to him as a hydrologist to understand when this could happen and the extent to which it would affect everyone, because he needed to make sure that he had the correct dam walls, the correct infrastructure in place to consume the flood if it did come. That concept actually has moved over to finance, and specifically into insurance, in a subject matter called extreme value theory. And there, it's all about tail events. And what they've done there is create quite a extensive and deep subject matter that is quite tractable and very parametric, and looks at how we can go about valuing these sort of black swan events. But the caveat there, again, is that it is not strictly deterministic. It just gives us a sense of how much more we need to put aside, how much more we need to save in the event something really, really goes wrong. Still doesn't mean that you're going to have enough, but at least you've made the effort to try and mitigate as much of it as possible.
Okay, that's fascinating. Cool. That clears it up. So I guess the only other question I have is, how are these models, the largely theoretical models, generated? Do you just look back 20 years and try and determine how many things nobody expected has occurred there? Or do you assume that over a long enough time period, something is going to go horribly wrong and you just sort of factor that into the calculation?
Well, yeah, that's the interesting thing. So everyone is familiar with the Gaussian distribution, or otherwise known as the normal distribution. The interesting thing about the normal distribution, which I'm sure everyone knows, it's a very naturally occurring phenomenon, right? It's not something that some man has just constructed out of nowhere. It's actually something that you see that happens around us in nature every single day. In the same sense, tail events, things that are extreme, seem to happen with a certain amount of frequency as well, with a certain amount of devastation. In risk parlance, it's you've got two different ones. You've got low impact, high frequency events, which effectively is your sort of normal distribution event, and then you've got your low frequency, high impact events, which are effectively your tail events, your black swan events. Now, again, there are subjects out there, there are subject matters, and there is a field of knowledge out there that looks at trying to understand exactly how to cover for that. And the one field that clearly has encapsulated that a lot is insurance, because your insurers, let's look at Lloyd's for instance. I particularly like Lloyd's because they've got something called alternative risk transfer, which means that they look at all kinds of insurance, from something called catastrophe bonds all the way through to looking at life insurance. And all of these elements need to somehow be quantified in a manner that allows them to conduct a business in the back of these extreme events. And that has come through, obviously, many, many years of exploring different types of mathematical approaches, and obviously through many, many years of capturing the correct data and analyzing that data. So you look to the insurance companies first to see how they have understood real extreme events, and then we port some of that over to the capital market space, or anywhere there's a stochastic process underlying an asset, and we apply that, and we try and figure out, to the best of our ability, what we need to put away for that rainy day when that extreme event occurs.
Okay, I think I can wrap my head around it now. So that's what I love about these conversations, is that you've just actually opened my eyes to the fact that insurance isn't the worst thing in the world. It's actually fascinating.
Oh, insurance is, the funny thing is, I started out with the idea of being an actuary, and I decided, well, actually myself and my professor, we sat down and we kind of looked and said, maybe you need to go into more sort of derivatives and financial engineering rather than insurance. So we sort of shook hands and we parted ways. But within actuarial science, if you look into the sort of history of where it comes from, it's absolutely fascinating. Mm-hmm. The first sense of it actually started with, I'll give you an example, like Scottish Widows. Now, Scottish Widows was formed because, I might get this wrong, but it was a collection of the ministry in Scotland. They wanted to make sure that when one of their priests died, one of their clergymen died, that they had enough left over for their families to be looked after. So they basically started keeping data about who passed away when, at what time, and how much was needed to compensate their families, to look after their families. And from there, Scottish Widows was basically created. And now it's one of the most established and one of the oldest insurance companies in the world. As I said to you beforehand, Lloyd's was a coffee house. It was really where businessmen got together and they said, well, I want to send the ship to around the Cape of Good Hope, and maybe go to India to go pick up spices, but I don't know if it's going to be back. What happens if I lose my ship? What happens if I lose my product? What do I do? And there was a businessman that said, okay, cool, I think this captain is really good. He knows how to do this. He's experienced. I'll underwrite it. And the concept of underwriting was literally someone taking an original contract and signing underneath the signatory, therefore creating the notion of underwriting. I mean, all of this basically plays into the fact that extreme events, these extreme irrational events, have always been part and parcel of everyone's world. And even though it is not the most intuitive thing to quantify, very smart people have attempted to quantify it. And a lot of it actually has been, to a certain extent, quite successful, at least in terms of understanding these extreme events that we face. And this is all because of the actuaries that have formulated the life insurance and the alternative risk transfer markets. We just borrow a lot from them. And then obviously you've got the econophysicists that appeared in the 1990s, where they They had a look at how certain phenomena happen in the real world, and they've seen how extreme events were considered there, and they also ported their knowledge over to the financial space.
It's amazing. By trade, I was a systems administrator, and so it sounds like there's some overlap here, because in systems administration is trying to quantify the inevitability of disaster as well, but probably on a less important scope than in actuary. But there's some alignment there. All right, sorry for getting you down this road. We can get back to the talk if you like.
So so we have a break for any other questions, or shall we carry on?
Yeah, I'd love that. I haven't been paying attention. No, it doesn't seem like anybody's piped up. I usually give that reminder, and I've forgotten today. Anybody in the chat, if you have any questions at all, feel free to interrupt at any time. We're happy to take any comments. Or David, is that you starting to ask one? Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I had to fix that feedback. Yeah, so I actually also posted this GitHub page that Scott Entrepreneur, or whatever his name is, he put together. He's been doing a pretty good job of doing a text summary of all of these risk meetings. So I sent that also to you, Steven, if you want to take a look at it. Yeah.
Amazing. Oh, that is actually amazing.
Yeah, you should thank him. It probably cut down a bunch of work.
Yeah, I have. Actually, I'm talking to him and trying to encourage him to do even more for us. So it's been a good conversation.
Okay, so then to get on to points again, if there are no further questions. So we covered correlation risk and economic capital meaning how much money do you put aside for all these really, really terrible things. And then in order to have that money put aside, which is kind of like your I don't want to use this term, but it's almost like an insurance fund. How much do you need to pay the person to provide that fund? And that is effectively a component of the stability fee. But in no short order, let's go into governance. And effectively, the responsibility of MKR token holders with respect to governing the MakerDAO system. And the first thing I want to basically highlight is that MKR tokens should theoretically exist in two forms. The first form is to be constantly involved with the voting protocol, because we have something called a continuous approval voting system that affects state change. And you need to continuously apply your mind to the MakerDAO system to ensure that it functions in the way that you believe it should function. Now, if you're not in this voting protocol, then you're in the liquidity protocol. And what do I mean by that? That means that you either are holding your MKR token in your wallet, or that you desire for your MKR token to be a part of the secondary market. Now, that's the liquidity pool. So you've got to basically have a good sense of where you want to be, because on the one hand, you have this continuous obligations, continuous fiduciary interest to ensure that MakerDAO as a system is achieving its single objective of creating a stable coin. And if you're not doing that, then you are in the process of discovering the value of what that vote means, which is probably, I don't want to be flippant here, but probably the first time, at least in my conceptual history, that someone can actually put a real value on a vote. Because it's simply a case of, if you're not contributing to the vote, that means you don't see a reason to be voting right now. And if you don't see a reason for voting right now, someone else might. And in that, they may find value in doing so. So they'll purchase your MKR tokens from you. If you find that you want to sit back and allow this process to first discover itself, you obviously might have your MKR tokens in your wallet. It is a form of almost good apathy. It's a very strange thing to say. It's almost contradictory, because that means you are still cognizant of your two options. Do I want to be in the voting construct, or do I want to be in the actual liquidity pool? Those three options are always available to you. And in there lies the essence of governance. In there lies the idea that you need to be aware of the fact that you have these options, and if you take the options, you've got fiduciary interest that you are giving to yourself. You do not have accountability to anyone else except yourself. In that, you actually extend accountability to DAI users and CDP users and other stakeholders. But essentially, it is an extension of having that fiduciary interest to look after yourself and what you see as the correct direction and deterministic function of MakerDAO as a stablecoin provider. Let that one settle in for a bit, because it's a kind of a new thing. On the one hand, you've got a force saying you need to vote, and on the other hand, you have a force saying, well, you need to liquidate. And those two forces will constantly be banging against each other. And in that, you'll come up with this diamond of price discovery on what a vote really means.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. And it touches on one of the things that people wrestle with when they're first looking at the MakerDAO ecosystem is, what are the incentives to maintain that stability? Because we have disparate groups of actors that presumably in any kind of economic system are self-interested, right? The CDP owners want more attractive rates. The DAI holders potentially want a better savings rate. We have various groups of arbitrageurs or traders that may want something completely different. But I think you touched on something that kind of crystallized it for me, is that as a cohesive whole, everybody's goal should be the stability and trustworthiness of the DAI coin itself, of the token. And anything that jeopardizes that stability, for the ability for stability seekers to purchase the DAI token, is bad for everybody ultimately, because if nobody uses DAI, then the rest of the ecosystem becomes superfluous, sort of.
So I want to give a shout out to 0x, and particularly an article written by their governance researcher. I think his name is Peter Zeitz. He wrote a wonderful abstract on governance, where he took some ideas from the corporate governance world and he translated into how we should start thinking about these things in a decentralized world. The aspect was very clear. It said, what do you ultimately want to be in terms of your governance? Do you want to have some sort of equity finance structure where you have, one share, one vote? Or do you want this consumer cooperative where basically you don't have real sense of increase in value in your vote, but you've got a very simple static structure going forward about who says what and when? Problem there is that if you have the equity structure, then you're going to be subjected to plutocracy, formation of cartels. You're going to have your natural problems involved with that. But if you go to the consumer cooperative, then you won't have traction. You're not going to attract funds. You won't have the ability to take this forward. It's going to be a slow process. So therefore, you have to be very clear about what your organization's intent is so that it matches that structure appropriately. The overall suggestion, and I hope I don't discredit Peter Zeitz saying this, but it really is a case of saying, what's the hybrid? What's the in-between that's going to match your organization? And I would stress to go and read it, because it really is really good. He's going to have a couple more coming out as well. I'm looking forward to those articles to read. So that's 0x. But with respect to us, the one thing that I noticed is everyone's discussion about governance was around that point. It was constantly around this whole idea of saying, what does governance mean? How does it form plutocracies? How do you make sure that those plutocracies don't define, and this is one part I've actually started writing in my third article, is you can have a, what's the correct word? You can devolve into these states where you've got so many groups that form around what their interpretation is of what is good for the system, that eventually the group construct forms where it's more important to win rather than actually create a better interpretation. So you start getting these special interests, and it's nothing wrong with it. It's just a natural state. It's kind of like the lesser of the evils, but not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Special interest groups, and you've got lobbyists, things that obviously resonate with everyone as something terrible and something you want to do without, But that's what happens when you do not have an objective that is painfully clear, that is very obvious. So from the MakerDAO's point of view, and this is where I think we have that leg up, is that we've got this all roads lead to Rome mentality, where all the roads are the incentives, and they're all pointing towards Rome, which is the stability of our coin. It is very clear how and what we need to do in order to establish the stability of the coin. And this whole foundation is based on vetting through rigor and scientific inquiry. So there's no subjectivity here in terms of finding, what our goal should be. There is going to be, different interpretations of how we can go about aligning those incentives. I'm not saying we are completely devoid of subjectivity, but we've taken a subject matter that is extraordinarily broad and really represents the last 2,000 years of thought. And we've said, well, instead of trying to tackle that monster, why don't we just realize that our system is all about a singular purpose? And if we can focus on that, we can reverse engineer out a governance structure that has a better chance of ultimately achieving that objective. So on that note, I'm going to stop for a moment and see if there's any questions. Nope. Okay, then I shall continue. Well, what I also found further with respect to governance was that you've got a clear sense of granularity that's going to create a permutation of governance structures, where beforehand, if you have a look at the sort of public governance or corporate governance and you have a look at all the research behind it, it generally gravitates to certain structures. No matter where you start, you end up gravitating to certain structures. And those structures are generally representative of how open interpretation is of what you want to achieve. I mean, if you have a look at any one country, the purpose of governing that country is what? I mean, everyone would say, well, freedom, liberty, inclusion, but these are very strong words, but they're open to so much subjectivity, you cannot figure out, the ideal construct, or at least come down to an ideal construct that would achieve it. So certain formulations appear and everyone will always gravitate towards them. And we'll start discussing everything from, they'll start discussing everything from, communism through to capitalism and everything in between. That's where I need to reemphasize again that when you talk about governance on a chain like Ethereum or on a chain like Tezos, you got to have a look at that and say, well, that is a different kettle of fish. We're talking about a completely different thing. Ideally, what they want as an objective is completely different to what we need as an objective. That being said, one needs to consider the systematic and existential form of our governance versus, for instance, Ethereum's governance. One of the questions posed to me was, is there a direct link between the two? Now, will our governance affect Ethereum's governance? Now, given that, will any governance affect the native blockchain's governance? It's an interesting point to ponder on, but that really starts talking about almost like what are the monopolies on each of these chains? Will there be a consequence of someone being dominant and therefore their form naturally takes over the form of the underlying blockchain? I don't know. It was just a sort of interesting question to think on.
Well, I guess that, sorry to jump in there, but I guess that implies the question, does MakerDAO run that same risk? Do you feel that there's a group of actors in the system that could potentially come to dominate or to take precedent over the rest of the groups?
I think that it is going to be, I think that there's a very good question there, but let me just answer yours. I think that the natural growth of the economy on the blockchain will determine that. I know that's an abstract answer. It's almost like saying that if you find that MakerDAO does actually facilitate all growth in the blockchain economy, then yes, you're going to find that our governance is going to sort of define how Ethereum is used. But I want to facilitate growth on the blockchain, not all of it.
Mhm.
I'd like that to be shared. I'd like that to be uniformly shared, because the more distributed it is, the less we are going to be subjected to one point of failure. Because if MakerDAO does become that monopolistic tendency on Ethereum, then Ethereum has one point of failure. Or at least it's got one point where if it doesn't work, this whole thing goes back to scratch. So there is that aspect to keep in mind. How that's going to play out, I really don't know. It's very organic. It really is a case of what organizations will release their goods and services onto the blockchain, when they do it, what traction are they going to get, how we are going to help them facilitate their transactional value and generate their revenue and get valued and get a sense of value on the blockchain as well. I don't know, but I mean, these are the things that you have to look out for and realize as they start occurring. One needs to figure out how to manage it. One needs to figure out how to actually be a part of it and bolster it, as opposed to exploit it. Yeah, Mariana asked a question here. Steven, do we foresee a conflict of interest when proof of stake be implemented between stability fee, DAI savings rates? Well, what's POS then?
I could probably jump in. So when Ethereum moves to proof of stake, there will be rewards for staking your Ethereum.
Oh, I see that.
Or would we become a sort of a competitor to proof of stake, the natural Ethereum staking?
Oh, yeah, okay. Sorry, now I understand what you're talking about. Sorry. That just swung me around a bit. I have no idea. No clue. The point being is, it's almost like the same as saying, will our governance affect their governance? Because you got different incentive structures, different objectives. If they overlap, yes, there's probably going to be some sort of competing dynamic. How that's going to manifest, I have no idea. But in terms of its dependency, that's kind of a only time will tell sort of situation.
Yeah, I think that there might be some different use cases here. So if somebody's seeking leverage, they're not going to get leverage from staking with proof of stake. They can get it through our system. And it's important to remember that when multi-collateral DAI comes out and all of our dreams are realized, Ethereum won't be the number one collateral type that we have. It'll just be part of a portfolio. So I'm not entirely sure that, I guess my hope is that in 6 or 12 months, it won't really matter that much if Ethereum or proof of stake becomes fantastically popular. That'd be my guess. Did that cover your question, Mariana?
Yeah, totally. Thank you, guys.
POS, Nick says that POS has dynamic returns depending on how many people are staking, and I did not know that. Interesting. Nick, you're around a microphone. You want to give us an explanation?
Sure. So proof of stake has kind of a certain kind of inflation rate built into it. And so regardless of how many people are staking, that is going to be, what is distributed. And so as, more and more people stake, right, the return per individual kind of goes down.
It's interesting. The last time I read about it, I thought they were just debating whether it was 1% or 3% or something. But I guess that makes sense because the more people, that just increases the number of validator nodes, right? And they want to reduce that over time. Interesting. All right, thanks.
If this launched like right now, right, like the DAI supply is like way too small, I feel like, to even, factor in here. But if, we have 1 billion DAI, 2 billion DAI, whatever, I think there would definitely be some kind of, kind of equilibrium kind of reached between the two, where, right, as soon as proof of stake has any kind of better returns than DAI, right, people will pile into proof of stake, which will kind of just bring the rate down until it kind of converges on what the DAI savings rate is.
I guess that's interesting to contemplate whether proof of stake and people locking up their ether in the MakerDAO system don't ultimately achieve the same goals, right? Yeah, so well, I guess in proof of stake, we're looking for validators to sign blocks and all the rest, but it's also the goal of just simply locking up or lowering the velocity of Ethereum. And
a lot of people who are going to be doing the staking is pretty much people who want to hold on to their Ethereum, and then this kind of return is just an extra. I don't think people are specifically buying Ethereum just to stake it, right?
Yeah, the returns are so low, and there's also this risk of slashing too, which is sort of equivalent.
And also, I guess that we need to have into consideration what percentage of the total collateral of the MakerDAO systems will be in regards of Ethereum. I mean, we will have lots of collateral, right? I don't know which percentage of Ethereum do we foresee to be declared.
Yeah, I don't know, Steven. Can you make a crystal ball prediction of how popular Ethereum will be in 6 months in our portfolio? I know it's impossible. I just thought I'd throw it at you anyways.
No.
I mean, I don't think it's impossible. I mean, if you think about it, Ethereum is like the most liquid, one of the most liquid, digital assets around. I figure that it probably will have a large share of our initial portfolio for like the first 2 years.
Well, let's put it this way. I mean, there is an inflection point that needs to be realized, and that inflection point is when a certain mass of goods and services hits Ethereum. Because right now it looks just like a utility token, but it should actually represent a burgeoning economic system. And as soon as you realize that, then I would say that you would have a massive increase not only in value but in all sort of purposeful uses that you can have with it. But that's just me off the top of my head. There is this virtuous circle that I have, and that's why I like MakerDAO so much, is that you have collateral types that want to be included, and those collateral types will also need realization of value on Ethereum. So you've got that wonderful connection between being a collateral type, being able to provide DAI to the system, as well as participating in the system using DAI. So you've got that connection. And if we act as the appropriate flywheel to constantly bring true transactional value to each of these collateral types, so the economy on Ethereum will grow. And then folks will realize that Ether is not just the ability to function on Ethereum, but Ether actually represents that functionality and economic growth and economic value. So that's where I'm hoping that it will get its mass value spike from. I think it's going to be, my little prediction, in I don't know about 6 months, but certainly in 18 months, I would make the prediction that ETH is going to be more valuable than Bitcoin.
Whoa!
Oh.
You said that on camera. Wow.
Whoa.
I think the market cap of ETH is going to go past Bitcoin, especially if you.
Steven, would you eat anything if this did not happen?
No, I've seen too many bets. I'll bet $1, and that's about as far as I'll go.
I'll slow down. That's risk management bet right there.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting you. I had to.
No. I've seen too many bets go astray, and people had to put like salt and pepper on their hats or something. No, I'm not going to do that. But I have the sense that if you have a look at the natural momentum that we are getting, there's traction there, which means that people are starting to see the business stack building. You're looking at this and saying, okay, we all know what the underlying infrastructure looks like. We've got many use cases, from Ether to EOS to Tezos and so on and so forth. The point being now is not just looking at this as an infrastructure point of view, but now you're looking at this from an organizational point of view, from a DApp point of view, from a goods and service point of view, because that's ultimately where things are going to have to go. If this whole space needs to work, you need to have a goods and services paradigm in place, which means you need to have a supply chain paradigm in place, which means you need to have logistics paradigm in place. All of these things are required. This is what I like about Andreessen, because their first two core investments was Dfinity and us, which essentially means they're looking at infrastructure and transaction value. They're building something in that core portfolio that is going to be representative of a new economy. They see it coming, we see it coming, and I think we are wonderfully positioned to benefit from this. And if we see this coming and we're based on Ethereum, and I still think that, and this, I'm not technically inclined, so folks like Nick can obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there is a suitably competitive smart contract layer to Ethereum right now. Maybe more cogent, maybe more tractable, but I don't know in terms of value and community-based value that there is one that's better out there. So consequently, if there's going to be a dynamic growth in goods and services in the paradigm that requires the actual economy to grow, I stand to be corrected, but I think it's Ethereum.
Sorry, I'm not sure you're going to get any arguments here. I agree with you, Steven. I think that eventually it will be supplanted with something else, but that's a while down the road, and I think that everybody will see that train coming long before it gets here. So we'll have plenty of opportunities to expand.
The other thing that's also interesting is I've been not as exposed as most of our technical guys have, but to Polkadot and Cosmos. And that interoperability, even though I kind of, you want to talk about real governance, complication, and depth of thinking, Polkadot and Cosmos, that was really incredible. I was on a panel with one of the co-founders of Polkadot, and was really interesting to hear what he had to say. He articulated very well what the challenges he faces, and quite frankly, those are real challenges. And if they can bite down into that, and we as a system can actually port to various other networks, it just explodes even more for MakerDAO. There is, the only way I see us as an organization puttering along is if the entire crypto space is either hemorrhaging because of regulation or is derailed because of some strange legislation. I don't see anything else.
I asked earlier how to pronounce his name because this was a puzzle for me. It's either a pun on just one or Youst one. Joust. The question is, with the launch of Blockstream's liquid sidechain, has MakerDAO ever entertained the possibility of transitioning the protocol to a sidechain based off Bitcoin as opposed to Ethereum? I think that, Nick, you can jump into if you have some insights here, but I think that there needs to be some maturity, I think, in the Bitcoin RSK risk. Nick, correct me if I'm
Sure.
understanding their scripting language.
So I mean, core for us is that there is some kind of economic activity on some chain, right? There is some kind of liquidity of assets, because without that, right, you can't collateralize any CDPs. Nobody wants to, because there's no economic activity going on there anyway. So it's kind of we will probably never be the first to kind of move to a new platform. It would require a seismic shift of, the majority of liquidity moving away from Ethereum and bubbling up on some other platform before we'd really even consider
I agree.
To do with the technical merits of the platform that we're switching to. There could be another platform that is 100x better, but until there is any kind of liquidity at all there, it's a no-go, right?
Yeah, I think that's a point that a lot of people lose when they're talking about Ethereum killers, is they assume that a superior technological stack or increased transactions per second are the key to supplanting Ethereum, but it's not, and it's said over and over again. But it's the network effect. It's the incentive as developers. It's the huge community. It's where everybody's already doing business. So there won't be a situation where we wake up one morning and we find out that everybody's moved to Definity overnight and we didn't notice it. I think that it's going to be a long road, and as the ecosystem matures, we need to sort of remain cognizant that the I shouldn't say owners of the space, but the prime movers in the space are shifting over time. It used to be at the very beginning is whoever had used a particular wallet or whichever particular mining cartel was in control of things. That's what controlled where the activity was. And we're moving into this stage right now where it's the blue chip organizations, I believe, that are kind of setting the stage for where everybody transacts. It's the golems and hologers and MakerDAOs that make that decision.
You know, from the
sort of to touch on to Nick's point, wrap it up, sorry. We're getting to this point where I think the tail is going to start wagging the dog, where it's the collateral providers that are going to be sort of setting the stage for us. It's whoever puts 12 volts worth of gold on chain is potentially going to be deciding where organizations like us end up moving to, and then that sort of trickles down. At least that's my uneducated opinion, and nobody really knows what's going to happen in this space. So.
I mean, the one thing I always like to use as an analogy, and this maybe dates myself as well, but does anybody remember playing real-time strategy games? And what you had to do was send your peon out or your peasant out, and they basically got rid of the fog of war. Now, that's the same thing that's happening here. It's not so much a case of what pieces you put on the board. It's basically that fog of war that is actually cleared up so you can see the landscape in front of you. The space that we're seeing right now is constantly being redefined. It's constantly expanding. And, the notion of a winner takes all is starting to disappear very quickly. I'm starting to see that, especially from the stablecoin point of view, everyone debating. Even when I was on a panel in San Francisco, we're talking about governance, and what's the chap from Xerox, Will Warren? He sort of turned to me and he said, if MakerDAO turns out to be the stable coin of choice that takes over the world, and basically everyone uses it. And I looked at this and I thought, the narrative has always been that there's going to be one that rules them all, like a real Lord of the Rings thing. In my opinion, there are going to be many stable coins. You're going to find that those salient features of the different coins are going to resonate differently with different organizations. And it's going to be extraordinarily dependent on what the landscape is going to look like. So we can't rule these things out. We can't all decide to fight over the half-eaten apple at a freaking banquet table. It just doesn't make sense. So the fact that we have these different networks coming, and we have these different stable coins coming, I welcome it, because they're going to make things a lot clearer for us. They're going to help us. And if we don't sort of embrace them in terms of being participants now, all we're going to do is start shooting our own toes off. So that's kind of my opinion about how we're going to realize what this economy is going to look like going forward as well. And here in the tribe, sorry.
That was an amazing point to make, and I agree with you completely. I think that this natural human inclination to look for a winner is counterproductive in this space. There's room for a lot of different stablecoins. As long as we're the best and the most popular, I'm fine with a bunch of entrants into the market. That might be a good place to sort of stick a fork in it, though. We're at we're at the top of the hour now, though. So if anybody has any burning last-minute questions or points they'd like to make, I'll give you about 3.5 seconds to make it, or else we're going to shut this thing down. Thank you, Steven. That was amazing. Another, I think I counted three mind-blowing events. So that might be a new record. So thanks for that.
Have fun. It was fun. I enjoyed that.
All right, thanks everybody for showing up. I'll be posting this to our YouTube and to the subreddit momentarily, so check it out there. All right, thanks everybody.
Good. Bye, guys.
Everyone.